I'm very happy to be here, which is a cliche I'm sure you hear from every speaker that you bring to Omaha. So I better tell you why I mean it. First, I lost a crown eating breakfast this morning, and so I can't smile to let you know how happy I am to be here. I look like my 6-year-old grandson. I'm missing things in the front of my mouth. I'm also happy to visit a Jesuit school and continue to pay honor to the first sinologist in the history of the West, and that was Matteo Ricci, the first person to go to China. And of course he was a missionary. He did want to save souls, but he was also a first-rate scholar, very, very good scholar. And China and the Catholic Church, and maybe some Europe too, would be far different if the Church had paid attention to what Ricci said, rather than to the other political views that with the rights controversy that ultimately went against the accommodationist position. There's been a tolerance for different views among Jesuits, although it was the other Jesuits who did press for the doing away with Ricci's accommodationist position. I am particularly grateful and want to tip my hat to Dan and Susan Semrad. There aren't many endowed lectures in non-Western thought. There are a couple, now that there are Confucius institutes, there are a few kind of named things where you can do strictly China. But I see you've already had Africa here too. You've had Native American traditions. You have a very, very rich kind of orientation that comes to the college thanks to Dan and Susan's gift. And I want to equally thank and show my appreciation to a philosophy department that encourages and indeed celebrates the belief patterns of people from very, very different ways of thinking in different cultures at different times. Only about 1/3 of my invitations to speak in the U.S. come from philosophy departments. They're one of the last to see that we really need world philosophy now. In Europe and Asia, I have no trouble whatsoever, but still in the United States, it's a minority. Most of my invitations come from religious studies or Asian studies department. So in that sense, I want to salute the faculty of Creighton University as well. So I really am happy to be here and hope I can do what you expect me to do while I am here. The title of my paper is on justice, procedural, distributive, retributive, and restorative. That's a mouthful. A Confucian meditation. I was told there would be a kind of a mix of faculty from the arts and sciences, mostly philosophy, some religious studies, also some members of the public, and obviously some students who have been dragooned by their teachers into putting in an appearance here this evening. Occasionally I might look like I'm getting a little too much into philosophy and I'll only be talking to my colleagues in philosophy, but I'll try to keep that kind of to a minimum and unpacking it. It is now 40 years since John Rawls published his Ethical Theory of Justice, which brought to an end the absence of basic works in political thought that have been characteristic of Western philosophical writings for over a century and a half. Justice, long neglected by philosophers, became a topic of great concern, especially in the United States, very probably generated and spurred on, at least in part, by the civil rights movement and the Vietnam War. Robert Nozick followed Rawls fairly quickly with Anarchy, State, and Utopia, a libertarian response to Rawls' liberal theory. A large commentarial tradition on both books followed and continues today, along with other substantive works with justice in the title, especially, but not confined to, those written by Robert Solomon, Michael Walzer, John Elster, Susan Miller O'Keefe, and most recently Amartya Sen and Michael Sandel. I cannot begin to do justice to these works, and I'm not even going to try, in part because of the great and varied differences between them in both scope and content, many of which are based on whether the author believed the concept of justice belonged more fundamentally to political or to moral philosophy. But I'm also not going to offer specific critiques of these books here because I'll be critiquing them collectively, albeit somewhat indirectly, from a classical Confucian perspective. That perspective shares a few features with the views of justice defended by Solomon, Sen, and Sandel, but it will be better, I believe, if I just treat the Confucian views as sui generis for the purposes of this lecture. I should add at the outset that the Confucian critique of Western conception of justice would begin with a high level of skepticism as to whether or not it has been useful in modern philosophy to put political and moral philosophy into distinct sub-disciplines in the field. But I will not press this point any further this evening, because it will be taken up in a larger study that Roger Ames and I are doing now, our third book, tentatively entitled Role Ethics, wherein we are critiquing not only Western philosophical and religious categories, but the great bulk of past and present moral and political philosophy more generally, as they are grounded in a view of human beings, absent in the canonical texts of Confucius and his followers. The overall thrust of my remarks tonight can be stated rather simply. Within the economic system of corporate capitalism that now dominates the industrial democracies and most of the rest of the world, the more that procedural justice is championed and defended morally, the less will distributive justice ever be achieved politically. Or put another way, when viewed from a classical Confucian perspective, individual freedom is increasingly being purchased at the expense of social justice for an increasing number of the world's peoples in ostensible democracies no less than other nation states. Well, I also hope to have enough time to sketch at least briefly a Confucian orientation toward retributive and restorative patterns of justice too. My major focus will be on the distributive, and if I run on too much, we just won't do that. Finally and quickly, with respect to the adjectives in my title. By procedural justice, I use the common reading as insisting on the priority of the right over the good. Fair procedures and outcomes determine what is just. Distributive justice I will take as synonymous with social justice, as already suggested, i.e. having to do with the distribution of goods. And for present purposes, we may gloss the differences between purely material primary goods, such as food, medicine, clothing, and shelter, and other primary goods, such as dignity, health, and self-respect. Nuances of meaning notwithstanding, I shall use retributive justice as meaning basically what is included in the meaning of criminal justice, leaving aside consideration of specific theories of punishment, as each can be delinked in turn from the concept of retribution. And restorative justice, a relatively new concept, I shall use in the same way it has been employed in recent accounts of truth and reconciliation commissions. Turning directly now to distributive, i.e. social justice, greed, of course, is one of the major reasons the gap between the haves, the have-mores, and the have-nots is growing worldwide, even while we're gathered here together to discuss the topic. But the major problem, in my opinion, is conceptually much deeper. After all, while the rich continue to get richer, they remain far fewer in number than the shrinking middle classes and the ever more numerous poor. Statistics released last month show that fully 20% of American children are growing up in families whose income falls below the poverty level, even though over 3/4 of those families have at least one working parent. At the same time, our bankers, brokers, and others are giving themselves multi-million-dollar bonuses for bringing our country to the brink of financial collapse, and they've had us for it. No matter whether we are Democrats, Republicans, or independents, this state of affairs seems rather patently unjust. Why then aren't there more protests against such social and economic inequities, and elections to replace the politicians who sustain it? Why is it only the so-called nanny state that is being condemned, especially when it is endeavoring, however feebly, to ease some of the injustices rampant in our country? To begin answering these questions, as I believe a classical Confucian would, a close reading of the early canonical texts suggests a very different concept of what it is to be a human being than the concept which is foundational for modern Western moral philosophy and attendant politics. And consequently, they will have a different view of what it means to be a moral person and thus to act justly. Keeping in mind that there are no close semantic equivalents in classical Chinese, either for the word moral or for the word justice. Confucians certainly see each human being as unique, but they would not see persons as individuals, in the sense of being able to describe, analyze, and evaluate them psychologically, politically, or morally, in isolation from others. For Confucius, individuals cannot be the locus of human worth, nor the focus of ascertaining moral, political responsibility. It is not merely the term individual that a Confucian would object to, but rather the closely related term employed to modify it, autonomous. That is to say, to whatever extent anyone simply uses the term individual as fully synonymous with person, a Confucian would have no qualms about the usage. But individualism is a fundamental presupposition, not assumption, of modern Western moral and political philosophy always implies autonomous. Freedom is something individuals have, which grounds the possibility of autonomy. And here the Confucian would argue, I think, that the concept of free, autonomous individuals is not only a complete ontological fiction, it has become a highly pernicious one because it provides the moral and political grounding for an economic system which can no longer be seen to be a cure for most of the world's contemporary ills, because on their account it is at the heart of the disease. For the Confucian, we are all fully interrelated, uniquely specifiable, but always in relation to other human beings, and thus we are always encumbered. Freedom is not a state of being for any Confucian, but rather something at best to be achieved. And hence, because I am always relating with and to other human beings, I am in a sense less a human being than a human becoming at all times. Before I say more about the early Confucian concept of the person and the good society, however, I must first say a bit more about the ideology of individualism that undergirds the corporate capitalism that dominates the contemporary world, and has been a major force, especially in American politics and foreign policy, ever since de Tocqueville described that ideology in 1831 in his Democracy in America. This concept of the autonomous individual underlies virtually all of modern moral and political philosophy, and has, to my mind, at least two pernicious effects. First, it enables libertarians, growing in number both in the United States, Europe, and Asia, to claim a moral high ground centered in the concept of human freedom as the basis of political justice, with a consequent rejection of the concept of social justice as immoral. And so long as non-libertarians, conservatives, neoliberals, and socialists alike ground their objections to libertarianism in the concept of an autonomous individual, free and rational, I would claim that the challenges will always be successfully met by the libertarian, thus continuing to provide a moral basis for a more or less laissez-faire free market capitalist global economy that is exacerbating gross inequalities of human well-being within and between nation-states. The second reason I believe the concept of the autonomous individual is pernicious is its deep pervasiveness in the consciousness of Western intellectuals, to a depth that makes it almost impossible to see any alternative to individualism except a more or less faceless collectivism. That is to say, by challenging the concept of the autonomous individual on behalf of the Confucians, it may seem that I am at least implicitly linking them to one form of totalitarianism or another, Stalinist or fascist. But these are not the only conceptual alternatives, and are seen as much largely because of the effectiveness of the propaganda championing at all costs the capitalist ideology grounded in the concept of the free, rational, and usually self-interested autonomous individual, which leads in turn to another dichotomy between selfishness and altruism in the moral sphere. These dichotomies have been much too sharply drawn, in my opinion, making it difficult for us to entertain very new or very old ways of envisaging what it is to be human, and concomitant view of freedom, social justice, and other forms of justice as well, and what a good, decent society might be like for all of us. Why has this propaganda been so effective? In 1977, the philosopher David Gauthier published a seminal paper which did not receive much attention. In The Social Contract as Ideology, he claimed that in Western thought, social relationships were seen as construed basically in terms of contracts, real or implied, between two or more agents, self-interested, appropriative, and rational. He also claimed relatedly that in this ideology, the essential characteristics and actions of human beings are best described, analyzed, and evaluated on the basis of seeing human beings as most fundamentally free, autonomous, and rational individuals. From this ideological perspective, social relations will be seen as justifiable, i.e. as just, only as they are agreed to by individuals, self-interested, appropriative, and rational. Thus, within this ideology, society is not the natural state of and for human beings. It is an artificial construct. This article probably did not gather much attention because Gauthier developed his own views in Morals by Agreement within the same social contract model as did Rawls, i.e. neo-Hobbesian in orientation. But the second level analysis of ideology he gave in the earlier paper has implications that it is important to take into account as we attempt to sift through all the competing attempts to define justice written over the past 4 decades. Let me quote Gauthier. Ideology is part of the deep structure of self-consciousness. By self-consciousness, I understand that capacity of human beings to conceive themselves in relation to other humans, to human structures and institutions, and to the non-human or natural environment, and to act in the light of these conceived relationships. Unquote. Now, Gauthier is right, and I believe he is. It must be extraordinarily difficult not to view human beings, including ourselves, of course, most basically as free, autonomous, and rational, and usually self-interested, making it difficult, very difficult, to think or act on any other basis. Within this ideology, the idea of retribution as just deserts will probably play an important role in definition of justice. Ideas of social justice will be highly contentious, and restorative justice probably not even deserving of the name justice. At an even deeper level, Gauthier's analysis implies that so long as that ideology continues to grip us, it will not be possible to be objective or impartial in evaluating conceptions of justice or of human nature that are at odds with it. There is also an aura of the self-fulfilling prophecy about the idea. The more we see ourselves as autonomous individuals contracting with others rationally for our own self-interest, the more likely we are to become and act as such. But if we are neither autonomous individuals nor akin to herd animals, well, what else might we be? To answer this question, I turn directly to the Confucians now. By emphasizing our sociality, they simultaneously emphasize our relationality, both of which are instilled in us from birth as members of families. An abstract individual, I am not. Rather, am I a son, a grandson, a sibling, a nephew, and a cousin. Later I became husband, father, grandfather, teacher, student, colleague, neighbor, friend, and more. In all of these roles, I am defined in very large measure by the others with whom I interact. highly specific personages related to me in one way or another. They are not abstract, autonomous individuals. I live rather than play these roles, and when all of them have been specified and their interrelationships made manifest, then I have been thoroughly individuated, but with nothing left over with which to piece together an autonomous individual self. Being thus the aggregate sum of the roles I live, it must follow that as my roles change, so do I. Marriage made me a different person, as to becoming a father, and later a grandfather. Divorce or becoming a widower would change me yet again. Former students become young friends become old friends, all of which have a significant effect on who I am and am defined. All the more so is this true when old and cherished friends and relatives die, making me yet again a different person. As an aside, we can note that with the moral epistemology of Confucianism grounded in the family, the good will always have priority over the right in thinking about justice and the nature of our social and political institutions. This is not to say that Confucians would have no use for purely procedural forms of justice, that those forms could not stand in the way of achieving distributive justice, especially within the family, clan, or community. Although this early Confucian view of the human being is very different from the abstract autonomous individual, rational, free, and self-interested locus of moral analysis in Western philosophical thinking, it is, I hope, not seen as altogether remote from our lived experience. For the Confucian view is a fairly straightforward account of our actual lives, I believe. In order to be a friend, a neighbor, or a lover, for example, I must have a friend, lover, neighbor. Other persons are not accidental or contingent to my goal of following the path of being as fully human as possible. They're essential to it. Indeed, they confer personhood on me, and do so continuously. To the extent I live the role of a teacher, students are necessary to my life, not incidental to it. It must also be noted in this regard that, again, while I believe Confucianism must be seen as deeply spiritual, fundamentally religious, in order to be properly understood, there are no monks, nuns, anchorites, anchoresses, or hermits to be found in the Confucian tradition. The way is made in the walking of it, but one never walks alone. My colleague Herbert Finger, I think, put it most succinctly: for Confucius, unless there are at least two human beings, there are no human beings. Our first and always most fundamental role, as noted earlier, is as children. Shao, which Roger Ames and I translate as family reverence rather than filial piety, is one of the highest excellences of integrated thought and feeling to be nurtured in Confucianism. We owe unswerving loyalty to our parents, and our manifold obligations to them do not cease at their death. From our initial role as sons and daughters, and as siblings, playmates, and pupils, we mature to become parents ourselves, and become as well spouses or lovers, workmates, colleagues, friends. All of these are reciprocal relationships, best described as holding between benefactors and beneficiaries. Shang Xia, not superiors, inferiors, as too many of the translations of the text tend to do. The roles are thus clearly hierarchical, but they are not elitist. Each of us moves from benefactor to beneficiary and back again, depending on others with whom we are interacting, when and under what circumstances. When young, I was largely a beneficiary of my parents. When they became old and infirm, I became benefactor. And the same holds with my children. I am benefactor to my friend when she needs my help, beneficiary when I need hers. Taken together, the manifold roles we live define us as unique persons, undergoing changes throughout our lives, and the ways we instantiate those relations is the means whereby we achieve dignity, satisfaction, and meaning in life. The ideal Confucian society is thus basically family and communally oriented, relating to and with others as benefactors and beneficiaries in an intergenerational context, and deriving increasingly deep satisfaction from so doing. Confucius himself was absolutely clear on this point, for when a disciple asked him what he would most like to do, he said, quote, "I want to bring peace, contentment to the aged, share relationships of trust and joy with respect with friends, love and protect the young," unquote. Now, for all of these reasons, Roger Ames and I believe Confucianism is best described as a role ethics, and are currently collaborating on work with that title. Although not a theory as such, or at least not yet, role ethics is nevertheless unique, having no close Western counterparts, I believe. In the first place, it does not employ or seek any universal principles, because what we should do depends on who we are doing it with and when. Confucianism is particularistic to the core, in that we are always to do not what is right, but what is appropriate in a given situation. And what might well be appropriate for me to do with my grandmother may be significantly different from what I should do if he was my younger brother in that situation. And what it is maximally appropriate to do with this student may not be the maximally appropriate to do with another student. They do have personalities. Although Confucian particularism precludes universal moral principles, we would nevertheless make a few generalizations from the canon that are no less important today, I think, than they were 2,000 years ago. When interacting with the elderly, be reverent, caring, obedient. When dealing with peers, don't treat them as you would dislike being treated. With the young, be nurturing, careful, loving, exemplary. Of course, we did not learn these generalizations as moral principles when we were young, but it is on the basis of many and very loving interactions with my grandmother that I learned long ago to develop an approximate sense of how to interact appropriately with other grandmothers. Confucius is telling us that if we learn to get the little things right on a day-in and day-out basis, most of the so-called big things will take care of themselves. And in addition to grandmothers and other elders, the little things involve our close interaction with peers and those younger than ourselves. And in this way begins to bring home to each of us our common humanity. For all of us will go through all of these phases of life. I can only begin to fully actualize my moral and spiritual potential when I have learned from my interactions with my own grandmother that although each grandmother is surely unique, they share qualities, live their roles, and interact with others such that in one sense, when you learn to fully appreciate your own grandmother, you come a long way toward appreciating fully all grandmothers, despite differences in skin color, ethnicity, religion, or other characteristics. It is not accidental, for example, that when they show the bodies in Iraq and Afghanistan of dead jihadis, you don't ever see any of grandmothers cradling grandchildren in their arms, dead grandchildren. That we wouldn't stand for the war if we saw much of that. We can't get away from the fact that those are grandmothers. Being thus altogether bound to and with others, it must follow that the more I contribute to their flourishing, the more I too flourish. But that's not how I'm supposed to do it. Conversely, the more my behaviors diminish others by being racist, sexist, nationalistic, homophobic, and so on, the more I am diminished as well as diminishing others. In saying that I can only flourish as I contribute to the flourishing of others, and am diminished when I diminish others, I hope it is clear that I'm not proffering here a Confucian view of selfless or altruistic behavior, for this would imply that I have a free, autonomous individual self to surrender. But this, of course, would beg the question against the Confucians, whose views clearly show the supposed dichotomy between selfishness and altruism as a Western conceit, as much as the equally Manichaean split on which it is based, the individual versus the collective. In many respects, of course, positing autonomous individuals as the defining characteristic of the species served very well in the past as a very healthy conceptual check on all patterns of authoritarian thinking, from nationalism to racism to divine right of kings and much else. And we must therefore all continue to be grateful to John Locke for accepting that definition and extending it to include the possession of universal human rights. But Confucians are role bearers, not rights bearers. And it is here we can begin to appreciate their critique of procedural justice grounded in the idea of human rights. That idea is not, as Jeremy Bentham believed, nonsense upon stilts. Much good has come from acceptance of it, improving the lives of millions of people. But there is a dark side to this view, one is coming increasingly to the fore as the growing maldistribution of wealth, both within and between nations, becomes starker, and transnational corporations become less accountable to any political or legal institutions in their search for ever greater profits. This dark side of all ethics, grounded in the concept of the abstract autonomous individual and the concomitant view of universal human rights, is that when freedom is weighted far more heavily than social justice, the political, legal, and moral instruments employed in defending and enhancing that freedom ensure that social justice will not be achieved. To see more closely how and why this is so from a Confucian perspective, consider the U.S. Bill of Rights, enshrining many of Locke's views as amended by Jefferson and focusing on freedom of speech, of association, of worship, and to freely own and dispose of property legally acquired. Clearly, these civil and political rights, now regularly referred to as first-generation rights, are linked to the individualistic view of persons. If I am essentially free and rational, self-interested, and autonomous, then certainly no one else, especially a government, should interfere with my speaking my mind, worshiping as I choose, associating with whomever I wish, as I pursue the projects I have chosen on my own for myself. These civil and political rights are, however, purely passive, in that they are focused solely on freedom from, which can be seen from the fact that I can fully respect all of your civil and political rights simply by ignoring you. You have a right to speak, but not to have me listen. To appreciate the significance of this passivity, or negative liberty, as Isaiah Berlin defended it, we must look to the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which in addition to the civil and political, also lists a number of social, economic, and cultural rights, such as the right to a job, education, health care, decent housing, hospitals, much more. These are Articles 23 through 27. These second-generation rights are active rather than passive, concerned as much with freedom to as freedom from. They are active in the sense that there are certain things I must do if you were to secure the benefits of these rights. At the least, I must pay more taxes. By simply listing all rights seriatim, the Universal Declaration implies that they are compatible with each other, but they aren't. For if I acknowledge your rights, claims to housing, health care, a job, and so on, then I must actively help you obtain them so that you may pursue your projects. But then I'm no longer free to self-interestedly pursue my projects. And consequently, I'm going to be strongly inclined to deny that you have legitimate social, economic, and cultural rights at all. That I, too, could secure the material benefits accompanying second-generation rights is no counter to this argument if I can believe I can secure those material benefits on my own, or in some freely chosen, rational contractual form in conjunction with a few others. Nor can it be replied that I may freely choose to assist you on my own, for this would be an act of charity, not an acknowledgement of your rights to those goods. Consequently, if I am well off, I will be strongly disinclined to see second-generation rights as truly rights, for I would surely be less free and not as well off if they were. Rather will I want to exercise my freedom to spend money to elect officials who will see them as hopes or aspirations, as the U.S. Senate, for example, has done while it refuses to ratify and has refused for 30 years the Second International Covenant on Social, Economic, and Cultural Rights. A former UN ambassador to the Jean Kirkpatrick said, "Those aren't rights, those are letters to Santa Claus." It's a direct quote. This argument can be put another way. The odds are fairly high that much that needs to be done to achieve social justice will not be in the individual self-interest of the haves and the have-mores of this world. It is therefore not surprising that the wealthy in the U.S. and elsewhere deploy the considerable political and economic means at their disposal to ensure that a meaningful redistribution of primary goods will not be enacted into law. But to oppose poverty alleviation measures seems, on the face of it, cold, callous, cruel. Thus, a moral justification will be needed to celebrate, or at least tolerate, the rich and the powerful, and be needed to justify maintenance of the status quo. In the past, this fundamental conflict between issues of personal freedom and social justice could be papered over, the Confucian would note, by championing freedom today and claiming such social justice for the moral. The ethos of capitalism allowed the haves to avert their eyes from the have-nots by insisting on economic growth as the cure for poverty. As the pie got larger, everyone would get a larger share. Social justice would be achieved without any sacrifice of individual freedom. But it is, I believe, a fantasy to think that, as capitalist apologists would have it, poverty can be overcome simply by increasing productivity. Among scientists, there are virtually no dissenting voices to the claim that the earth can no longer endure the exploitation and mutilation it has suffered in the past few centuries, and it continues apace today. As one economist sociologist put it in response to policy proposals to end the economic recession in the U.S., quote, "Attempting to grow our way out of unemployment is ecological suicide," unquote. This perspective suggests that distributive justice will only be achieved by a number of measures of wealth redistribution, which the wealthy know very well. In other words, if poverty is to be eliminated in the name of achieving distributive social justice, and if the economic pie cannot be increased any longer at the earth's expense, then the extant and future pies must be apportioned differently, and that cannot but be at the expense of the well-to-do, which seems to require a diminution of personal freedom. The more money I must give to aid the plight of the less fortunate, and the more regulations I must endure in the search for increasing my wealth, the less free I really will be. It's true. We might thus anticipate that not a few among the rich and the super-rich and their political servants, there are now over 1,200 billionaires and 8 million multimillionaires in the world, will be unwilling to pay that cost, and they will defend their unwillingness morally by making an appeal to individual freedom and autonomy as trumping matters of legislation aimed at the alleviation of poverty and the regulation of corporations. If we believe as individuals that we do not need our brothers' help, or our sisters either, in getting on with our lives, why should we believe we are their keeper? If we can take care of ourselves, why can't they? And we all know who they are. It is in this way that the very wealthy, and unfortunately a number of others, justify their behavior morally. They are not going to say they are greedy, selfish, avaricious, unfeeling, or have any of the more despicable qualities, many of them at least on first glance may appear to have. Rather are they going to say they are acting on principle, a moral principle, especially the principle of the inherent freedom of individuals to pursue their own project as they wish, so long as they respect the similar freedom of all other individuals to do the same. These people are thus only insisting on the right to be left alone and to dispose of their resources as they see fit. But this is by no means the extent of the libertarians' moral argument. Most such people will also claim that in the long run, The overwhelming majority of people will be better off if individual and corporate, usually freedom, is protected in all areas at all times for all persons not imprisoned, letting the free market reign for the maximally fair distribution of all goods. To achieve this noble end, no distinctly visible hands need apply. Put another way, very few Wall Street bankers or brokers and others among the wealthy think of themselves or want to be thought of as moral monsters, I suspect. Hence they advance moral, political, and economic arguments with the help of everyone from Ayn Rand to Adam Smith, Robert Nozick, Isaiah Berlin, Milton Friedman, Ludwig van Mises, Friedrich Hayek, and a host of other important thinkers to get themselves off the ethical hook. That a number of these thinkers are economists is of no moment here. The economy drives the politics and the cultures of the society comprising the global village today, and thus its norms and values as well. And of course that nowhere that one can find more full-blown defenses of freedom as an unalloyed good than in the writings of Immanuel Kant and John Stuart Mill. Thus, on the libertarian account, my major obligation to you is simply to leave you alone. And that's all I'll ever ask of you in return. I'm not responsible for being born white or male or an American or whatever, any more than I am responsible for your being born a Congolese, a Cambodian, rich or tall or short. I am now responsible for myself and for those with whom I freely contract mutual duties and obligations. Thus, I'll find my own job, I'll retain my own health insurance, develop my own pension plan, purchase a home when I can afford it, see to the education of my children. Thank you. Knowing that everyone pursues their own self-interest, I'll also participate actively in the electoral process, where the competition could be no less fierce than in the free market. On all of these scores, you should do the same. If misfortune on any or all of them should befall me, I'll suffer them in silence and not ask for a handout from you or anyone else. I received no inheritance from my parents, but I certainly do not want to be told I cannot leave the wealth I honestly accumulate over my lifetime to my children. Note here that for all of these affirmations, I can formulate an action-guiding maxim that I can will to become a universal law. Rest assured I have taken Kant seriously. Moreover, as suggested above, the great bulk of mainstream economic thinking undergirds this view, namely that the whole world will eventually be more prosperous for a great many people if the free market reigns and those involved in those markets enjoy maximal freedom at all times to invest and produce as they think best in their self-interest. Those few who don't prosper will have only themselves to blame. That is what the concept of individual responsibility is all about. On this account, individual and corporate freedom and self-interest will bring about the greatest utility for the society, which of course shows that I've also taken Bentham and Mill very seriously. If we object that we all have some obligation to eliminate poverty, the libertarian can demur, saying he bears no responsibility for the plight of the poor and consequently has no moral or political responsibility to relieve it. I may give generously to charities, he will say. It's my business and no one else to decide how much and to whom. If we further object that the history of capitalism over the course of the past 150 years does not warrant optimism about significantly reducing the number of people living in poverty, he will reply that the fault is with many states, we're all hearing that much today, that have continuously interfered with free market exchanges. Remove the constraints and the best possible measures of social justice will be achieved without sacrificing individual freedom. We may continue to raise objections to the libertarian account, but we should not count on any of them having much purchase. The libertarian's views are reasonable. They can constitute a viable moral belief system with a number of straightforward implications for political no less than moral theory. If one accepts that human beings are basically free, individual, and autonomous selves, you will not, I submit, ever denude the captains of industry, the banks, and the other wealthy of their moral cloaks, nor rein in their dominance in the political arena. I'll say it once more, we purchase freedom at the expense of social justice. Role-living Confucians, on the other hand, can indeed condemn the libertarian and demand that governments reallocate material goods and services to achieve a just society. Further, even though Confucians would be skeptical of the concept of human rights so long as they were seen to inhere in autonomous individuals, we may nevertheless see that from their perspective, there would be no gap between the second and first generation rights as found in the UN Declaration. If my primary responsibility to all others is to help them flourish, then of course I will give great weight to social, economic, and cultural rights. But from the role-living perspective of the Confucians, the goods that attend first-generation civil and moral rights flow just as easily. If my aim is to aid your flourishing, why would I want to restrict your freedom of speech, not let you associate with others of your own choosing, forbid you to embrace the faith that sustains you? That is to say, when grounded in role-bearing persons, moving from second to first generation rights is straightforward, but the converse does not hold. To rights-bearing individuals, civil and political rights loom very large, but that there is a gulf between them and second generation rights, which no one has yet successfully breached, and I have little reason to believe that moral and political philosophers will reach them tomorrow or the next week. Now, I've been talking about 45 minutes, and I haven't talked at all about restorative justice. I have the restorative justice, which is a shift from what we've been talking about in here, because I want to kind of show the breadth of the Confucian orientation and how the notion of role-living human beings invests a wide range of our activities and concern. But if there's been enough now to talk about, I can quit now, or I can go on for about 10 more minutes and talk about restorative justice. I'm getting some, go ahead, and some say, quit. Democracy is wonderful. All right, let me continue, I'll try to make it quick. Let me elaborate briefly the significance of approaching the overall concept of justice from the Confucian by looking at two other dimensions of it, retributive and restorative, and doing so in the context of truth and reconciliation commissions. Beginning with South Africa after the fall of apartheid, Truth and Reconciliation Commissions came into being as a way to begin healing the racial, ethnic, and religious strife that has been convulsed a number of nation-states or nations in the making. None of those commissions have been altogether successful thus far, and yet clearly there will be a need for many more such commissions in many countries and areas now or in the near future. Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, however, should not, from a Confucian perspective, be seen as all of a piece, because as presently constituted, one or another of the goals of such commissions must be seen as basic. Correctly so, because the twin goals are not fully compatible with each other. Establishing the full truth of what deeds were done and by whom on the one hand, and effecting reconciliation between parties to the conflicts on the other, are difficult for any single commission to accomplish. Both efforts seek justice, but the concept must be defined differently for the two goals. The Nuremberg and Tokyo war crimes trials were just that, trials. The victors worked mightily to establish the truth of the evils perpetrated by the vanquished, but the goal was to bring the criminals to justice, a goal clearly grounded philosophically in the concept of human beings as fundamentally individuals, individuals responsible for their actions, with justice demanding retribution, i.e. punishment, for those actions. When people demand truth and reconciliation commissions for Rwandan Hutus or the Cambodian Khmer Rouge, they usually have something like Nuremberg in mind. A not unreasonable assumption or analogy to draw given the magnitude of the horrors visited on the victims in those two cases. Every person of goodwill must want the perpetrators brought to justice, and indeed they should be. But it will surely be a retributive justice that is obtained, and it will be seen more or less as vengeance, no matter how fair the proceedings. Vengeance, however, seldom generates reconciliation. Moreover, truth commissions function basically with a cluster of legal concepts in an adversarial setting, which may well be important for establishing appropriative retributive justice for fair punishments, while a reconciliation commission requires a cluster of concepts drawn from religion, although of no particular creed, with its major task being the healing of deep fraternal and sororal wounds within its jurisdiction, and hence the aim will be to achieve restorative justice. Retributive justice for criminal acts must surely be served before reconciliation can take place in a number of cases. But if it is retributive or criminal justice that is basically sought, the prosecutorial task should be entrusted perhaps to the International Criminal Court, not interstate. On the other hand, national reconciliation can be effected by a National Truth Commission if reconciliation is kept as the paramount goal of the Commission, because both perpetrators, survivors, and relatives of the victims must all participate actively in the proceedings as the commissioners. Whereas with non-restorative justice-seeking truth commissions, only the commissioners themselves need to be active. If seeking true reconciliation, perpetrators must not only be persuaded to tell the truth about the acts they committed against the victims, but if clearly wrong, the perpetrators must come to acknowledge that those acts were wrong. And wrong here is not a hopelessly relative term of art. If there was no general agreement within a country that terrible things were done to some people by other people in that country, there would be no internal call for the establishment of a reconciliation commission. Admissions of culpability must thus be made in the old-fashioned religious way, rather than in legal terms wherein "I did it" is sufficient. Legally, no remorse need be shown or apologies offered, nor can it be if the accused pleads innocence. Confucians would find it very grating. When a truth commission begins to function like a criminal court in seeking justice, even the "I did it" is unnecessary, for we all have a right, or should have a right, to remain silent. Following this act of confession, a religious term, telling the truth and acknowledging that what one did was wrong, comes an equally proactive act of repentance, again in the old-fashioned religious sense, a public commitment never to act in that way again, which should be followed in turn by yet another positive act, originally religious in nature, of atonement and expiation, psychologically and materially, and in other ways endeavoring to repair the damage caused by the repentant. These attitudes and actions are far more conducive to reconciliation among role bearers, it seems to me, than attitudes of finding of guilt, which is Western and not Chinese, or actions of a non-rehabilitative kind in the form of punishment for the offending autonomous individual. To appreciate why this is so, we must keep in mind that reconciliation, from a Confucian perspective, requires at least two groups to come together, and consequently victims and their family must also participate actively and at times heroically in the efforts of a truth commission dedicated primarily to reconciliation rather than simply retributive justice. This is no more than to say what is obvious, that acts of forgiveness, no less than confession, repentance, and atonement, are necessary for true reconciliation. The survivors and families of the victims can come to see the offenders as other role-bearing human beings, not merely as individuals to be punished retributively. They must struggle to rid themselves of the desire for revenge, and they must be open to seeing themselves in the future as being possible benefactors and or beneficiaries in relationship to the offenders. That is to say, a commission seeking only legal justice need not require perpetrators to be active in the proceedings at all, and the victims can remain passive onlookers except to describe what was done to them by whom. The greater the threat of severe punishment, i.e. retribution, the less likely are perpetrators to tell the truth about their deeds and or will attempt to justify them in some way, i.e. as justify means I was only following orders, etc. And faced with such behavior, it is little wonder that most victims will be loath to engage in acts of forgiveness. In such circumstances, it would be a miracle if reconciliation accompanied or followed the pursuit of retributive justice. But to the extent a Truth and Reconciliation Commission is successful in getting perpetrators to confess, in the old sense, repent and want to atone, they will, all in all, by so doing, be seeking, another religious term, redemption. Merely going to jail after conviction of crimes is not redemptive in and of itself for the convict, and will almost never be restorative for the victims and their families if they are only passive observers of the proceedings, especially if the perpetrator does not acknowledge responsibility for his deeds or does not repent from them. But if a reconciliation commission does its work well, the victims and their families, by their acts of forgiveness, become redeemers, can become redeemers for the perpetrators, renewing the significance of their own lives as well as aiding the perpetrators to forge new ones, and together may achieve a good measure of restorative justice. You see how different a world it is when we always see each other as intimately linked to the others with whom we are acting. I hope it is becoming clear that there is a parallel between free, autonomous individuals demanding legal justice from the Truth Commission when crimes have been committed, and role-bearing persons seeking reconciliation from the Truth Commission when anti-human behavior has broken the social bonds within or between ethnic, religious, or racial communities and families on the other. Certainly free individuals can and do reconcile, and role-bearing persons can and do demand legal justice, both rightfully so. But just as second-generation human rights encompass first-generation rights much more naturally than the other way around from the standpoint of a human, from Confucian being a person, so too I believe is the restorative justice attendant on reconciliation broader than legal justice that requires it, while legal justice is much narrower and does not require it. Forms of justice other than restorative, grounded in the idea of individual human rights, must surely have a place in the affairs of each nation. But reconciliation requires much more and different ways of thinking of what it is to be a human being, I hope of the 21st century. And on that basis, I commend the text of classical Confucian to your attention. Thank you very much.